Stuart started to talk about kind of what I see as the more real potential of crowdsourcing and crowdsourcing interactions with governance, which is a much deeper level. With all respect to some of the stuff we heard this morning, getting feedback from a community is great, but understanding that that's just getting feedback, understanding exactly where that falls on that scale of interaction is really important. And there's a potential to do a whole lot more here. There's a potential to do things that look like real direct governance, but it is scary. It means giving up real power. So I want to talk a bit about how that can go wrong in specific ways that are about how the process can go wrong, not about how the giving up power can go wrong, because that's just politics. So we're familiar to a certain degree with how small crowdsourcing efforts fail. And I'm going to start with an overview of that because it's useful in terms of looking at how some of the bigger efforts fail, because they have all the same efforts or all the same risks as the smaller efforts, and then a few additional ones. So the first one is lack of interest. If you have a bunch of people in your room who are completely bored and really don't care about what you're doing, I guess you got them into the room, which is maybe something, and you can use their presence there to pretend that somehow validates whatever decision you were going to make anyway, but you're not actually getting any useful feedback from them. Usability, especially if you've got any kind of digital crowdsourcing system, any kind of online platform, that kind of thing. One of the frequent things is that it just ends up being impenetrable. You're trying to get people to push complex concepts into a system which is not necessarily going to support the ideas that they need to shape. Selection bias, do you actually have the right people in the room? And if you think you have the right people in the room, is that actually a problem because you've got all the right people in the room and they're the same 5 guys who were there last week and failed to come up with an answer then, and they're not going to do any better when they're sitting in a circle instead of a square. Buy-in and political interference are kind of some of the more important ones because these are the two that actually get a lot worse when you are dealing with a more real system. Buy-in, great, you had an idea, you crowdsourced a bunch of stuff, but it turns out that management wasn't actually on board and it doesn't matter because it's not getting implemented. And political interference that the crowdsourcing totally came up with an answer, but this exercise actually had a right answer and that wasn't it. So what if you're actually dealing with a more significant process? So a couple years ago, or a few years ago now, Iceland decided it wanted to rewrite its constitution. And they were going to do so, not in a completely crowdsourced way, but in a much more participatory way than you would think of as a normal constitutional process. Which ended up being, it was a really interesting and innovative, but much more than that, insightful process into the shape of future Iceland. And it ran into a lot of these problems. Among other things, it ran into both the buy-in problem, where the new document that was created, or the entire process was kind of tolerated by certain parts of the government, but they never really took it seriously. And there were some efforts at political interference along the way. And the whole process is now, at least, it isn't off the rails, but it is slightly sidelined with a last-minute illegal act by the outgoing government, but it's another story. So if you're trying to do crowdsourcing at that scale, and a lot of this didn't happen in Iceland, but if you're trying to do that in a larger nation state, if you're trying to have a serious online crowdsourcing effort, one of the first things you need to deal with is that you are now a very high value target if you're going to have any real power over the future of that country or the future of that organization if you've got a more complicated organization. So one of the big lessons of the past 20 years in e-voting is don't. A lot of people have tried to come up with electronic voting systems that all had significant problems for one reason or another. And the fundamental issue is that it's not actually possible with our current level of technology to secure an e-voting platform in a way that is reasonable given hostile nation-state level politics. It's just simply not possible. So if you're going to build a crowdsourcing platform that operates electronically, that is interacting in this space, congratulations, you've now got a nation-state scale electronic voting system that you need to somehow secure and figure out what secure even means. Data leaks, so if you're dealing with information that has some effect on the security of either the country or the people involved, and so as soon as you start doing crowdsourcing seriously, it means you're asking people to express serious positions. And there's a reason why in traditional democracy we generally had a secret ballot. It's because it's not necessarily considered good for people to be subject to pressure on the basis of their votes. So your crowdsourcing platform is now responsible for keeping people's votes and interactions secret based on, the set of rules and interactions. You may want everything to be open and completely public, but that leads to other problems, and we'll get to those in a minute. And then you also have to deal with astroturfing, which is kind of the much worse version of selection bias. Congratulations, you're now a big enough target that it's worth me spending the money to spin up a secret call center somewhere, staff it full of people, each of whom is managing 15 or 20 different profiles and commenting on issues and that kind of thing, and generally making what looks like an open and participatory conversation achieve the right result. How do you deal with that? This is a complicated and relatively unsolved problem. So there are a lot of other issues which are in some ways endemic to any kind of participatory politics. Now, we're not used to the problems of participatory politics, or we're not used to thinking of them, because our only model right now for participatory politics is representative democracy, which is a fascinating joke when it comes to participation. Voting every 4 years or 6 years or 2 years or whatever has almost nothing to do with any meaningful participation. And if you start looking at what happens when people get to directly talk about and discuss every issue, all of a sudden you're in a completely different position. And when you're building a crowdsourcing platform, that's what you're doing. So the first one is the tyranny of discourse. I love this photo. It's from a TED Talk. I have no idea what the context was. But so you end up with this position where you've got the old white guy who's up on stage, who's used to being listened to, and he's just like, yeah, you know what? In general, even if it's not quite that, direct, people are used to listening to folks whose ideas make sense. But what they're listening to most of the time isn't the idea, it's the discourse. It's the way that the idea is presented. If you want a participatory crowdsourcing platform, this is a problem for you because you need to override that. If you want everybody's ideas to actually get listened to, you have to figure out how your platform is going to overcome the fact that some of those ideas are going to be very well presented by people who've, say, been management consultants or politicians, are used to and comfortable with speaking publicly, are used to and comfortable with selling ideas. And those ideas may or may not be the best ideas in the room. And the best idea in the room might come from the janitor who really understands the problem and how to solve the situation, but has never spoken in public before. Overcoming that is hard. I've heard of ideas as extreme as saying, okay, well, we're only going to do video, and we'll do voice and action coaching with everyone, or provide surrogates to help people sell their ideas, and everybody has to work through the same pool of surrogates. Basically to try and get rid of that discourse privilege so it becomes about the ideas. Now that's a really high-touch intervention, and it's an incredibly slow intervention. How do you maintain the benefits of flexible, fluid, online, immediate crowdsourcing, and also deal with the fact that somebody has spent 20 years writing and really knows how to pitch an idea in one paragraph? So the other thing, the next participatory political issue is the tyranny of free time. I'm going to stand here and I'm going to pitch the same idea at every single meeting, and eventually you will accept my idea just to shut me the hell up and get me to stop coming to your meetings so I stop wasting everybody's time. I'm sure if you've dealt with these kind of situations, you're familiar with this. Also, even if it's not that extreme, what you're getting is you're getting the people who have time to show up, right? You're getting the people who say, yeah, you know, Wednesday afternoon, I think I'd like to spend 6 hours talking about where I think the future of this company should go instead of 6 hours building the future of this company. Even if you say, okay, fine, we're all going to sit down, we're going to have the company-wide meeting or the ministry-wide meeting, and everybody has to be there. You know, there's the 3 people who have something critical going on and who are exceptions. Okay, so now you're no longer, now you're getting all of the people whose time wasn't so critical that they couldn't come up with an excuse to get out of this. Privacy and minority opinions, especially when you're dealing with social issues and you're trying to crowdsource stuff around social issues. This is a massive, massive deal. I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion here. In Germany, the Pirate Party is doing some really great stuff, or at least some really interesting stuff. There's a platform called Liquid Democracy, or Liquid Feedback, sorry, which is one instance of the concept of liquid democracy. And a lot of this is kind of geared to a platform like that, a lot of what I'm talking about. So liquid democracy is a direct delegatory democracy platform or construct. The idea is every single person in the country votes on every single issue, which is great. It doesn't scale, but that doesn't matter. What you do is you say, okay, for this issue, like medical issues, I'm going to delegate to my family doctor because I trust their opinion. Oh, wait, my family doctor's Roman Catholic. Okay, so everything except family planning, I'm going to delegate to my doctor, and those I'll vote for myself. And, I've got a brother who's a lawyer. I'm going to delegate a big chunk of stuff to him. And this one guy in town has these great ideas about zoning, so, we'll just delegate everything to him. Hey, wait, he's actually a developer. Okay, I'm going to retroactively recall my delegation the week after the vote. That's fine. We can do this. We don't need those vote totals to be fixed ahead of time. Building an electronic system that deals with all this is quite easy. Getting it usable is more complicated. Dealing with all of those small failures is more complicated. They're still working on some of those. Now, the way they deal with the electronic voting system problem is by saying, okay, well, we'll make all of our votes public. And we'll confirm all of those votes at a quorum meeting once every now and then, once every month or something. And they have in-person votes. And they don't necessarily do those on everything, but if there's something that's big and contentious, you can show up and confirm your vote. Which does a great job of dealing with the electronic voting system. They just do the real votes, the ones that confirm the count in person. Solved. Now, the Pirate Party doesn't really have a political, or doesn't really have a social platform right now, which is one of the many cases where, as a political platform, they're somewhat more problematic. But so this makes it easy for them, and it's also really just run by straight white guys, which also makes it easy because they don't have minority opinions. So they don't have to deal with, oh, what do you mean it will be like socially difficult for you to vote for something that you feel very strongly about? So if you're building a crowdsourcing system that is encouraging discussion, is letting people propose issues, is doing all of this kind of stuff, you need to deal with the fact that a lot of the issues that people might want to propose, they can't talk about in public. Or they certainly can't talk about with their name attached to it, which means you need to support anonymity. And that means it needs to be real anonymity because there's real lives at stake potentially. So what you're building when you build a platform like this, you're not just building a crowdsourcing platform, but the rules of how that platform works are a politics. And if you're doing crowdsourcing at a state level, if you're doing crowdsourcing that has a meaningful impact on people's lives, that's a pretty serious politics. So, you may have the best of intentions of how you want to solve some of the issues I've raised and a whole pile of other issues. But one of the things that you need to be aware of is, like the pirates saying, well, okay, we'll solve our e-voting system by having people vote in person, that solution to a potentially purely technical problem is now having a coercive impact on real people's lives. That the rules of the platform are the rules of the society, and that code is, in this case, law. It's not just that law is code. So who shapes your questions? This is something that comes up a lot. There was a big crowdsourcing effort in the past year, I won't name which one, that asked a lot of questions about, you know, how society should be run, and this and that, and the future, and energy, and water, and all sorts of other things. And those questions were shaped by a very specific client, and that client wasn't public. And that's not cool. So if you're doing these kinds of things, there is a degree of openness that needs to be maintained. However, just openness isn't really enough. You know, if you're a government ministry and you want to crowdsource around a bunch of specific issues and you set the questions, that may be okay. That may even be desirable in a given context. But understand that you are not being particularly participatory there. You're just asking people for their ideas or possibly their ratification of an agenda that you've already decided on. And if that's what you meant to do, that's fine, but that's what you're doing. And this gets into, you know, this you know, kind of related to the matrix that Stuart showed, the difference between participatory, open, and liberatory. Participatory is great. It means that you are actually engaging people in some meaningful way. You're taking some kind of feedback from them, that kind of thing. Open means that you're actually being honest about what you're doing. You're showing the results. You're actually giving people real information. Liberatory means something else. Liberatory means you're actually transferring power to people. I want to bring up one last example. Because, yeah, there are times when we don't necessarily want strictly liberatory processes. Crowdsourcing is great. Look at what Reddit did when it misidentified somebody in Boston during the bombing. That was a great example of crowdsourcing. I don't remember if he got actually killed or not, but these platforms have problems. You know, these things have real implications in the real world. It is very good to understand where the limits are and make those limits very clear. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have, say, a participatory justice system. That sounds like a really fascinating thing. I would love to see what that looked like in a meaningful, binding, liberatory way, but that doesn't substitute for due process.